In this video, I'll describe how spark timing works on the Model A, how the first automatic spark control device for the Model A was invented, and we'll look at how that device works. But first we need to talk about the basic theory behind ignition timing. I found this animation on a website from Brazil, which you'll see in a second is why the words are all in Portuguese. It's a good illustration of the four-stroke engine cycle that's used on the Model A. So you can see, right, so the engine goes around here. Here's the intake. And then there's the compression stroke. And then ignition. And then the power stroke. Or the expansion stroke is sometimes what it's called. And then the exhaust stroke. Right? Now the exact moment when the spark plug is fired, that's called the ignition. Now the timing of the ignition is measured in degrees. Degrees refers to the rotation of the crankshaft. The position where the piston is at the top of its travel, so right here, that's called top dead center, or TDC, so that's 0 degrees. If the spark plug fires before the piston reaches top dead center, or BTDC, that timing is measured in positive degrees. So if the spark plug fired here, for example, where the crankshaft still needs to rotate another 30 or so degrees to reach top dead center, then your timing would be described as 30 degrees. If the spark plug fires after the piston reaches top dead center, or ATDC, that timing is measured in negative degrees. So if it fired right here, that timing would be negative 30. To advance your timing means to shift the timing of the spark plug earlier in the cycle. To retard your timing means to shift the timing of the spark plug firing to later in the cycle. So the question is, when is the best time to fire the spark plug? Well, to answer that, we first have to talk about how gasoline burns. So this is a rough diagram of a flathead engine. Okay, spark plug, it's up here, valves, the cylinder head right here, the piston, the connecting rod, crankshaft. And this is the combustion chamber, this area right there. Now, when gasoline burns, it creates two things: carbon exhaust and kinetic energy. And that energy exists as some combination of pressure and heat. And the more energy that you can channel into becoming pressure instead of heat, the more work that energy will do for you. And people often think of gasoline as exploding instantaneously in the combustion chamber. But in fact, gasoline burns over a measurable period of time. And the flame front takes about 3 milliseconds, roughly, to get from the spark plug to the edges of the combustion chamber. In other words, to burn all of the fuel-air mixture. As the gas burns, the pressure inside the combustion chamber starts to build up into a curve, like that. And then it peaks. So it peaks and drops again. So now here's the answer to our question. The best time to fire the spark plug is the time that causes the peak of that pressure wave to occur about 15 to 20 degrees after the piston has passed top dead center. Some people say 10 degrees, 10 to 20 degrees. And that's sort of roughly what you're seeing here. It's not a great angle, but you know, that's sort of close to 20 degrees right there. So this is roughly where the piston would be in the expansion or power stroke at the time that the burn reaches peak pressure. And that's the scenario that maximizes the conversion of the kinetic energy into pressure. And what that means is it produces the most torque. Just as a side note, the degree timing that produces the most torque is called MBT timing. MBT stands for maximum brake torque. It's called brake torque because all this stuff is typically measured on a dyno, which applies a brake to the engine to produce load. So the torque that the engine puts on the dyno is called brake torque. All right, there, now you can impress the hot rod guys with your trivia knowledge. But remember, when the engine's running, the piston is moving fast. So if you wait to fire the spark plug until the piston is at 15 degrees ATDC, well, then the pressure won't peak until the piston is far past that point. So that means you'll lose a lot of your kinetic energy as heat rather than power. That's why one of the things to check for if your Model A is overheating is your spark might be coming too late. So to get the peak pressure to occur after TDC, just after TDC, kind of right here, you have to fire the spark plug before TDC. And as your RPMs increase and the piston starts to rotate faster and faster and faster, you got to advance the spark earlier and earlier to get that peak to come at the same point, right? Now, there is one scenario where you don't want the spark to come before TDC, which is when the car is off and you're trying to start it with a hand crank. Because a hand crank moves the pistons very slowly. And if you fire the spark too soon and the piston is moving too slow, then the pressure wave can actually make that piston reverse in its path, which is called kickback. So you need the spark to actually fire late to kind of help you get the pistons turning over fast enough that the engine can keep itself going. In this scenario, having a lot of excess heat is actually good because you need the engine to get up to operating temperature quickly. So it's good that it's throwing off a lot of heat. So the challenge with ignition timing is to design a system that can fire the spark late in order to start the car, but then as the car runs and speeds up, to fire it earlier and earlier and earlier to convert the maximum amount of combustion energy into power, but never firing it too early. Because even when the piston's moving fast, if you trigger the combustion too soon, you'll send a shock wave down through the piston, into the connecting rod, into the crankshaft, and you can damage the engine pretty seriously, and that is called knock, and we'll get to knock in another video. All right, everybody got that? I hope you're all taking notes, because it's going to be a short quiz next period. So how does the Model A solve this problem? Well, every gas-powered car has 3 specs related to ignition timing. So there's the initial timing, that's the degrees of advance used to start the car. And there's the total timing, which is the maximum number of degrees that the spark can be advanced by whatever mechanism is controlling the advance. And then there's the timing curve. The timing curve is the method or the calculation that's used to determine where on this line the engine should be based on what the engine is doing right at that second. On the Model A, the initial timing is 0 degrees and the total timing is 40 degrees. Now, when we talk about total timing on the Model A, remember, we're talking about the maximum possible advance, not the maximum recommended advance. So on the distributor body, you've got this slot right here. And this allows the points to be advanced 20 degrees relative to the distributor cam from their initial timing of 0. So here they are. Might help if I hold it upside down. So here's the initial fully retarded timing at 0, and you can move it this far. That's about 20 degrees. That's the maximum possible advance. Remember that a 20-degree rotation on the distributor equals a 40-degree rotation on the crankshaft. And that's because the distributor shaft turns at half the speed of the crankshaft. So because ignition timing is measured in crankshaft degrees, we say that the total timing is 40 degrees. In practice, about 30 degrees advance is the maximum that's usually recommended. Now, if you're familiar with cars from the later 30s and 40s, you'll know that the total timing number we're talking about here is really high, right? So those cars, later 30s cars, at 2,800 RPM which is, the fastest you'd ever run a Model A, they would be doing about 24 degrees advance, not 30, certainly not 40. So why does the Model A use so much total advance? Well, there's two reasons. First, the cylinder bore is relatively wide, 4 inches. That's 30% wider than the V8s that replace the Model A 4-cylinder engine. And it just takes fuel longer to burn in a bore that's wider, so you need to move the spark earlier to ensure that you hit peak pressure at the right time. The second reason is that the Model A uses really low compression, 4.2 to 1. The V8s that replaced it typically use 6.3 to 1. The lower the compression, the longer the burn takes, because the molecules of oxygen are farther apart from each other, and because with lower compression, this is kind of getting into the weeds, but there are more exhaust products mixed in with the fresh intake air. All of that causes the oxygen molecules to be farther apart. It takes the burn longer to jump from one to the next. So these two factors together mean that the Model A total timing needs to be pretty high, but the initial timing still needs to be low so that you can crank start it if you want to. Now, the Model A's timing curve is manual. That is, the spark advance is entirely manually controlled. So the advance is whatever the driver decides to make it. Now, when you graph a timing curve, usually you'd make the y-axis the degrees advanced, and you'd make the x-axis whatever the independent variable is that the engine's responding to. So, for example, RPM. So we draw a Model A timing curve. You'd have degrees over here, RPM over here. And the usual curve would look something like this. The driver starts the car and then just immediately moves the spark advance lever to some arbitrary setting that they like, and then they just leave it there until they turn the car off. Now, you might be thinking, wouldn't it be better to automate this somehow? And the answer is yes, it definitely would. In fact, other car companies had been building automatic spark advance into their cars for over a decade when the Model A was introduced. Ford got on the bandwagon with the Model B in 1932, which used a very similar engine to the Model A. But by that time, third parties had already started to introduce add-on automatic spark advance. This is the patent application for a Model A automatic spark advance. The inventor was Frank Williams. He was an engineer who worked in the Boston automotive industry, and it's clearly designed to work specifically with the Model A. I mean, this is a Model A engine right on the front of the patent. Now, I don't want to give Williams too much credit here. He didn't invent this from whole cloth. This design is very similar to a Delco spark advance mechanism that was on the market in 1913. But what Williams did was figure out how to adapt that mechanism to the Model A while making only minimal changes to the engine. And Williams filed this patent in January of 1930, so at that point the Model A had been out for 2 years. Sometime later that year, he sold his rights in this device to the Phillips manufacturing company, and they continued marketing it as the Phillips automatic spark control. You can see on this box here, they've just pasted the word Phillips over the word Williams. Now this is an original sales brochure for the Williams automatic spark control. It's got a picture of it here. It talks about how annoying it is to have to manually adjust the spark timing. It says it is humanly impossible for anyone to perfectly adjust the hand spark lever at all speeds. Tells you what, this is going to happen, and this is my favorite. Then comes the disagreeable job of shifting gears. Not always successful. Poor people unsuccessfully shifting gears. Anyway, then it tells you how great, all 6 reasons life is going to be great after you install this device. Well, luckily for us, about 20 years ago, a company called Nurex decided to reproduce Frank Williams' device. Now, I've got one of these in my coupe right now, but I didn't want to pull it out. So they were kind enough to loan me one for this video. So this is it. Now, if you look at the drawing on the patent here, you can see kind of where this is situated in the engine. So Here's your camshaft, right, running horizontally, and then on the camshaft is a worm gear, and then right here is the oil pump drive gear assembly, which has a helical gear at the bottom that meshes with the camshaft, and below this is the oil pump, and above this is a bearing, and then the lower distributor shaft, which connects to the upper shaft, which passes through the distributor. Now, in the stock engine, around this shaft, there is the drive gear coil spring, and that spring pushes against the top of the valve chamber and holds this bearing assembly down against the bottom of the valve chamber. But the Williams device is supposed to replace part of the lower shaft, and once you do that, the drive gear spring won't fit around it. So instead, the function of that spring is replaced by a flat spring, which braces against the inside of the valve chamber. If you want to see how that works, there is a video of how to install the Nurex version of this device that I will put a link to in the upper right corner here. Now, the device itself consists of two shafts that can rotate in relation to each other. So the writing actually goes on the bottom. So this is the lower shaft, and then there's this upper shaft and a kind of a collar here. And this toroid weight is mounted on a gimbal. So the gimbal passes through both shafts. It's mounted in the lower shaft, but it passes through kind of a hole in the collar here. And this toroid weight is held in place with a torsion spring. And one end of the spring, probably can't see, but one end of the spring is embedded in the weight, and then the other goes through this notch at the end of the gimbal. And as the lower shaft, so this part's the lower shaft, as the lower shaft is spun by the drive gear, the weight pivots on the gimbal, which then rotates these drive pins, 1, 2 drive pins right here. I'm sorry, guide pins, rotates these guide pins in relation to this collar, the slotted collar, which is attached to the upper shaft. Now, the slots on this collar are slanted, so as the guide pins move, the upper shaft is rotated relative to the lower shaft. Let's see if you can see it here. So I'm going to hold the lower shaft steady, and I'm going to rotate this. And can you see how the notch in that upper shaft moves? It does not move much. It just moves a little bit. That's all it has to do. So this is the fundamental action that advances the distributor cam. The relationship between the rotational speed of the shaft and the deflection of the weight is determined by the mass of the weight and what's called the spring rate of this torsion spring. And don't worry, I'm not going to go into the math on this one. But what I will do is show you, I'll show you this device kind of in action. And just remember, there's not very much deflection here. It's only 15 degrees. But because, as I mentioned, because the distributor shaft turns at half the speed of the crankshaft, if you're advancing the spark 15 degrees here, you're advancing it 30 degrees on the piston. So I've got a cordless drill here, and luckily the distributor shaft is exactly the right size, so I can just mount this on the chuck. Now, this is a 3-speed drill, and I happen to know that on speed 1, this drill tops out at 450 RPM. Now, since the distributor shaft, again, turns at half the speed of the crankshaft, if this is turning at 450 RPM, then the crankshaft will be turning at 900 RPM, which if you were in third gear, you'd be going about 20 miles an hour. So we're going to use some slow-mo here, and we're going to see what would be going on in the valve chamber as you cruise along there. You can really see how the angle of the weight changes as the shaft speeds up. Okay, that is it for part 1 of this series. In part 2, we're going to move from theory to practice by testing and measuring the timing curve of the NUREX automatic spark timing system in a working Model A engine. So I'm sorry there were no Model A's in this video, but I hope you stick around for part 2. Thanks again to Bob Gay at NUREX for generously lending me a demo unit and for answering all of my questions. Thank you, Bob.